Castree. I'm a qualified horticulturist, and I've been working with Norma over at the Food Collective at Polytechnic for some time. I was instigated way back at the start, and they had this big space, 30 metres long and about 19 or nearly 20 metres wide. That was really grassed area and not doing very much. So we turned it into what is now a community garden that's helping support people. And of course, in the process, we're teaching people how to grow some food. And I guess in this day and age where we live in fairly small blocks of land, it's even more so important these days to learn how to grow food and plants in small spaces. So today's workshop is all about espaliering fruit trees. Now, espaliered fruit trees, if you're not familiar with the term, means to make them two-dimensional rather than make them three-dimensional, grown out in an open wine glass shape or what have you. These are very narrow trees that fit primarily my favourite way of growing fruit trees, because everyone has fences and you can grow them parallel to your fences or your house. They don't grow very tall because you keep them as high as the fence, and you can use the soil below to grow other things. So on this plan that I drew up, you'll notice down the left-hand side, the long side, where it's got some arrows pointed to those trees marked there. This is an area where we're going to put in espaliered fruit trees, and it goes all the way up to the narrow end and then back around with a couple to the right. And where the rubbish bins are, there's also 2 or 3, in fact there'll be 2 espaliered fruit trees there. Now, the garden beds are in place. I'm not sure yet whether they have been filled with soil, but if not, that's no big deal. Once they are, we'll be able to get some trees in there. So, and if you haven't been to the garden before, this is a bit of it. So it's nice to sort of see it on paper and then see it come alive in real life. So, and just bear with me while I draw a couple of lines here over near where the tractor is. What we're looking to do is to put some posts and strain some wires in these garden beds to grow some trees between them, trained out along the wires, which is what espaliering is all about. So we're going to flank that whole side. So just bear with me if I go back. That whole side here, and there with espaliers, and here with espaliers as well. Okay, so there's a bit more of it, and as you can see down the bottom end, as it comes up round the bend, there's a couple of pieces of timber missing there. I'm sure they're in now, but these beds will be filled with soil, and this is where the trees will go in. And of course, we're going to need to put some posts in. So there's a bit more of it. So all the way up this long side, again, starting here, and we're going to have wires strained all the way through, obviously here as well. And so on. And they'll be about 6 foot tall, or 1.8 metres roughly. And they'll do a few things. They'll actually help buffer the wind a little bit, because it does cop a little bit of wind from this side, and that will help slow that wind down. Now, this is the sort of frame that we're looking potentially to put in. Perhaps don't need the middle post in this instance, but primarily the posts will need to be concrete at either end, and then the wires strained through the post, and I'll show you some detail in terms of how high up we start the wires. But espaliers can be trained against anything. It could be some mesh if you wanted to tie the tree to, because the wires really are only there to as a temporary measure to train the branches along to make them lateral. So horizontal branches produce far more fruit than any vertical branches generally do. So, and the reason that a lot of orchardists these days grow them as espaliers is because they're more productive. They actually produce more fruit grown this way, and they're much easier to look after, spraying and picking and pruning and all those things. And that's basically what an espalier sort of looks like, picture format. Post either side. Generally, the first wire goes in at around about knee height, or about 60 centimetres. And then generally, and it's really up to you, you don't necessarily have to stick to these guidelines, but I find that you're able to fit more branches in at this. So at each 30 centimetres, you put in another wire. And once it gets to about the height of your fence, that's as high as I let them get. That way it makes it easy if you have to put nets over them come the summer months when the birds start to decide they want your fruit more than you do. It makes it very easy for you to attach nets with a few screws or nails tapped into the fence. You can clip your net in over the top of it and pull it over the top of the tree and down into the ground, put some tent pegs into the soil, and that way it stops the birds from getting to them. So very, very easy to do. If you're going to grow something in your backyard, I wouldn't put it against the fence. I would come off the fence at least 60 centimetres. That way, if ever your fence needs to be replaced, you won't have a tradesman getting in the way of your nicely manicured branches and where your fruit timber is on the trees. And of course, fences don't last forever, so it's reasonable to assume at some stage your fence may need to be replaced if you're there for a long time. So, and as you can see, and these are apples, and these have been in for some time now. They significantly fruit very, very well. Again, it's a great way of being able to grow fruit. It's very easy and highly productive. Whilst they aren't using the soil below to grow other things, but I highly recommend to do that because it actually helps shade the ground, keeping more moisture in, and you can actually add some companion plants in the ground to actually assist the trees keeping pests away and also attracting and pollinating insects, which I'll talk about a little bit further into this presentation. But as you can see, it's a great way, and they look fantastic too, even without the leaves. When they drop their leaves, they look quite interesting to look at, and they're quite pleasant to boot. So here's one that's typically close to the fence. That's probably a little bit close to the fence as far as I'm concerned. I think that should be probably a bit further away from the fence, but you get the idea. These are pears, as a matter of fact. And in terms of the sorts of trees that you can grow as espaliered trees, is really up to yourselves to some degree. Apples, pears, cherries, plums, they're all excellent candidates for being trained this way. You can train citrus trees, but they're trained a little differently. They're not trained in this fashion. They're actually just made two-dimensional, so their habit of growth doesn't lend them to become what we call, this is called a formal espalier, which means that it looks formal, whereas an informal espalier is not. They often are just basically made a green wall, basically, and wherever the branches touch the wire, they tie them off, and anything that won't get tied off and is difficult to try and tie back to a wire or a trellis, you actually just simply prune off. Now, they look difficult, don't they? But honestly, they're very, very easy to train. And basically, the tree generally, I put one every 3 meters, or 10 foot in the old scale. And generally, if you're only going to put one of these in, then you would have a post either side at 3 metres. And I generally put a timber top on the top of them, if that's the case, and then strain the wires, as I said, at 60 centimetres, and then every 30 centimetres up until I hit to the top of the fence. And you plant your young tree in the middle of it, and as the lower branches reach the post, you simply cut them off. Anything that grows out toward the fence, you cut off. Anything that grows out towards you, you cut off. And anything that grows up off those lateral branches that you're training along the wires, you count up about 4 or 5 buds and you prune those off. That's it. That's all you need to know about how to prune these particular trees. Whereas trees that are grown in a wine glass shape or an open vase type shape are very difficult to try and prune, because most people look at them in amazement and think, I'm not sure where to cut. Whereas these have definite rules and ways that guide you as to where they need to be pruned. Now, they don't necessarily, this is also a formal espalier, but you can build some shape into these. This is a pear tree, and as you can see, all of the small flowering branches, and flowers means fruit, of course, is very close to the framework of the tree on each branch. You see, they're not very long, the branches. They keep that fruiting wood very close to the frame of the tree. And as you can see, where the wires pass the branches, that's where they've tied them off. And in fact, this tree is old enough now that they could actually cut those wires off. They don't need to have them there for that support. The tree will hold that shape now. But you can really have a lot of fun with these. As you can see, that's a particularly nice example of what we call a candelabra type shape, espalier pear tree. And again, because they're lateral branches, they produce far more flowers, more fruit, obviously. So it's a great way of, and as you can see, it's not against a fence either or a building. It can be done out in the middle of a yard somewhere if you wish, and a bit like where we have that space at the Polytechnic Food Cooperative. So you could possibly put some of these in there if you wanted to. There's another example. Now, this is a crisscross type shape. These are often done with cherries, and again, quite easy to do. It's just you've got to open your mind up to the possibilities of what sort of shape. And as you can see through the, if you look closely, you can see the wires, and they're just simply training the branches and tying them off where they touch the wires. And anything that grows away from the tree or behind the tree, they cut off. And again, any branches that come off these main framed branches, they keep them reasonably close to the framework of the tree. And it's very important you do that, because if you let those branches get long, when they get some fruit on the end of it, they're quite thin, and what often happens is that the fruit is so heavy that it quite often bends the branch, and you run the risk of snapping those branches with the weight of fruit. Whereas if it's close to the framework, it's quite strong and able to carry a good amount of weight. So now here are some examples or shapes that you could potentially train your trees in to be. And as you can see there, it's a remarkable amount of different sorts of shapes that you can train your tree into. And there's no particular need. I mean, you can train them in any shape you wish, just make them two-dimensional. So, but that'll give you a bit of an idea of the sorts of shapes that are available you could potentially have. Here's another example. Now, as you can see, that unlike that candelabra type shape, these are more angular, and between each tree, they've got one that's the reverse, and it's filling that space, and they're all espaliered along frames. And again, that whilst this is against the wall, and look, they were primarily used in walled gardens, particularly in the old Victorian food gardens, kitchen gardens, back in the Victorian era. These great big mansions obviously had to provide food well before supermarkets and so forth. So a bit of history about why they were, how they came about, to utilise the space wisely rather than have great big orchards on big expanses of land. They would have a brick wall enclosure that often was something like about 5 acres, and just on the inside of the wall, because the brick walls in the UK would warm up and they would radiate the warmth to the trees overnight. Of course, quite cool climates would be advantageous to produce fruit earlier, generally in seasons, and they would use that space to train them two-dimensionally, and they would encircle the whole brick-walled enclosure with these sorts of trees. And of course, they became quite inventive with regard to shape and so forth. And of course, in the Victorian era, it was all about looks rather than productivity to some degree. But they were very innovative, and obviously they paid great dividends. But what they realised was that just through training lateral branches the way they were increasing the yields of their fruit, which was something that we know today to be fact. So we're lucky today because, you know, if you planted a normal apple tree, once upon a time it would grow 6 metres tall and 6 metres wide, and for most backyards it's far too large. And apples, as luck would have it, and peaches, pears, you're looking at around about 300 to 350 apples all at once, or fruit all at once on most fruit trees. You know, that can be a lot of fruit. And what's happened over the last sort of 30, 40 years, the horticultural industry has come to the fore and has been able to develop rootstocks that grow a certain size or suit certain soils. So these are called dwarfing rootstocks, and today you can buy or get fruit trees grafted on anything that, as you can see, the very smaller end, about 1.8 metres all the way up to about 4 metres, and everything in between. So gone are the days where these would be invasive trees that would get into pipes and lift foundations or lift paths and so forth. These dwarfing rootstocks no longer have tap roots. What they used to do in the old days was they would plant 2 trees or 3 trees sometimes in the same hole in an effort to try and dwarf them, or they would drop a great big stone about 2 or 3 feet down into the hole that they dig, and then they would put some soil over it, and then they'd plant the young tree there. And then the taproot would then hit the flagstone and would hopefully stunt it. But we've come a long way from those days, so we have all of these wonderful different sorts of rootstocks that we have available today. I actually use one that's, I don't think it's listed there at the moment, but it's called an MM102, which is generally the ones that are generally mainly used today. They're somewhere in between the medium size, around about 2.7 to 3 metres high, but they lend themselves perfectly to an Espalier rootstock. This is one in my backyard, as a matter of fact, and as you can see against the fence, it's off the fence a bit, and this is a Angelina plum, and that's to the stage now where I don't really need to have that frame. I could take that frame away. I've got this here to remind me to talk about the fact that if by chance you're going to just put a normal fruit tree in, they are quite complex, as you can see, and these are the ways you need to think about having to prune them. And as you can see, as the trees get bigger, they become more complex to have to work out what you need to remove and what you need to leave on. And I guess that's one of the reasons why I favour, you know, espaliers, because espaliers seriously make it so much easier to prune and to be able to set up. and the reason I have this here is to go over the fact that it's this simple: 3 metres apart, about 1.8 metres high. You buy a young fruit tree of your choice. Pick something that has got some lower lateral branches that are going to lend itself to the, the first wire that you've got in, something around about knee height, and prune out everything else that's not going to play the game or is not going to be able to be trained on the wires. And make sure when you plant your young fruit trees that about where the roots start, about 4 inches or 100 millimetres up, you'll see sometimes you'll see a bit of a scar or a knob that looks like that's where the graft is. Make sure that you keep that the same height that it would have been in the ground. It needs to be out of the ground, the graft. Don't be covering that up. Most important. Probably around about, well, you just got highlight, that would be probably about there where I put that red dot, would be about where the graft would be. So most importantly, you don't plant that. And then you simply very carefully bend the branch down, and you don't necessarily need to do it all at once. Sometimes, you might only be able to tie the first little bit of the branch until you get a bit of growth in it, and it becomes nice and supple. And then just simply tie them off onto the wires. Now, what I tend to do when I'm tying them is I don't use those wire ties. I use material. You can actually buy this at some of the large hardware chains. It's called Jolly Tie. It's the same like the material you use. It's stretchy, and I just simply tie it in a loop, and pull it reasonably tight, and it grabs itself. And as the tree grows, it tends to open and allow the tree to grow. And every so often I'll go through as I see the branches starting to, to grow up, and they will sometimes. They'll start to do that. Simply lay them over and tie them off. It's very simple. Now, as you get branches that start to grow from here and the like, obviously they're going to need to be trained along the wires. Sometimes you'll find that your tree may not grow the branches where you need them to or you would like them to, and I'll show you some tricks down the track to convince your tree to grow where you want it to. Now, when you buy trees these days, they're somewhere in between about 4 foot tall or 1.2 metres tall, all the way up to about 1.5 or 6. Bare rooted, which means generally they have no soil around their roots, or they're in bags that have only got mulch in them, which is generally the cheapest and the most convenient way to buy them. And they'll have branches all the way around. So again, you've got to stand back and sort of look and try and envisage that these branches that I'll highlight are the ones that you're going to keep. All the others you would prune off. So I hope that makes sense. Everything else that's not going in the direction that you want that. So you want to be able to look through the tree and ensure that those branches are sort of in the same plane through the tree as the main trunk, so that when you put it in the ground and against the wires, you can easily bend those branches down a bit lower to match the frame, like that. Now, you don't want to be buying big established trees because the branches will be so thick you won't be able to bend them. So it's really important to start with young trees when you're espaliering these trees. It's the young, reasonably supple branches that will lend themselves to being able to be bent like this. The thicker branches, you run the risk of breaking them or fracturing them off the main trunk, and if that happens, you're in some trouble. So, as I say, I highly recommend that you use young trees. Now, this is a multi-grafted tree, and I sort of said before that, you know, most apple trees get about 300 to 350 apples all at once, and for most backyards or for most families, 300 apples all at once is a bit too many. There's a limit to how much apple you can eat, apple juice, apple pie, apple sauce you can make. So this is a workaround, and what I've done, this tree started out life as a Granny Smith apple, and what I've done is I've multiply grafted, basically performed tree surgery and put other varieties onto this tree, and in this instance I've put early, mid and late varieties all on the one tree so that I stagger my picking time off this tree. And I said before that, you know, we all live on fairly small blocks of land, and I'm certainly no different. I'm on a 500 square metre block in Werribee. My house leaves quite a large footprint on the land, and I'm not left with a very big garden. I'm sure people, when they hear me talk about my garden, they think I'm on an acreage, but I'm not. I'm only on a very small block of land. And it was important to me to be able to fit as much variety as I possibly could on my block of land. So this was a workaround for me. So the first variety that I get to pick from is Arcane, which is a wonderful Japanese apple. And I picked through, and I picked that in around about January, and I'm still picking Granny Smith apples in late July, and I get to pick about 20 to 25 apples off each branch all the way through those months until I get to the Granny Smith. So I absolutely increase the picking that I get spread over time, which is a wonderful thing to do. And look, down the track, I hope when we return to some form of normal, I will show people and run some workshops on how to graft or how to do this on their own trees. There are plenty of resources on the internet that you can search to check out how to graft, but nothing better than seeing it live. So if you're interested, keep your eyes peeled for some future workshops at Polytechnic there, in the hope that we're able to show you firsthand how to do that. But you know, I've got 4 apple trees on site. I've got 2 in the back, and between those 2 apples I have 18 different varieties, and I've got 2 in the front. In fact, I've got 3 in the front, 1 in the nature strip, so two in the front yard, and I have another 18 varieties at the front. So in 4 apple trees, I have about 36 or 37 different varieties of apple. So who said you can't have an orchard in your own backyard? You absolutely can when you know how. So that's food for thought. Now, if by chance you're a bit tight for space, you can always grow these in a pot. And like I alluded to before, you can get some of the dwarfing varieties that grow even smaller than that 2.4 to 3 metres. Get ones that are only going to grow to about 1.8 metres or thereabouts, and they will grow reasonably well in a large tub. Now, this is an apple, and as you can see, they've grown quite a nice shape about this tree. And you'll notice again that the fruit wood, which is where the flowers are quite close to the framework of the tree. Now, they haven't used wires, they've used stakes, but that could just as easily have been a wooden trellis or a wire piece of reinforcing mesh behind it. It really doesn't make any difference what you use, just provided you can keep them tied off. And of course, when you're tying trees, you do need to revisit them occasionally, because sometimes what happens is that these ties can sometimes start and get grown over by the bark on the tree. So don't leave them so that they're so tight. You've got to check them every so often and just loosen them off a little bit, or sometimes retie them and replace them, because until the tree gets to the point where they're strong enough or old enough to to hold themselves up without the framework or the branches or the stakes rather. So now here's another one which I haven't really factored in at the Polytechnic site, but these are called stepovers. Now, this is one of those MM102 apples. They're normally would grow to about 2.7 to 3 metres tall. What they've done is they've cut the middle out of it and just left the two lateral branches and they've trained it between a couple of wires, and then kept, as you can see, the upright branches to provide us the fruit wood on the tree. And this would lend itself to become a side fence out the front, or either side of a pathway into your house out the front. I mean, a lot of people don't use their front yards very much. I certainly do. I've got to say, I make sure that I use whatever space I can. We spend a fortune on blocks of land, and it never ceases to amaze me that no one uses their front yard to grow food in. And it doesn't need to look like a vegetable garden or something, but you can imagine a couple of these either side of the front footpath or the path that leads into your house or beside your driveway. They're a wonderful way of being able to grow fruit. Here's another form of espalier. So, and I did say before, you can become very creative once you know and understand how to do this. So these have been grown over arches, and these obviously are apple trees, and they've done very, very well. It's a great way of being able to provide some shade and shelter in a backyard, or and of course, I don't know, I might speak to Norma down the track, and maybe we might be able to put something like this down at down there in one or two spots, maybe. You never know. But this is just an example of some of the things that you can be doing in your own gardens. It's not hard, and it wouldn't have to be this long. Obviously, it might only be one section. Imagine sitting underneath that in an afternoon or an evening when the weather's nice. This is another example of a backyard apple tree that has multiple varieties, and as you can see, this is not so much a formal variety. It's just been made two-dimensional. It's not as regimented shaped as the others, and just whatever works to get them to become two-dimensional to fit the space is the idea. Here's that tree I showed you earlier that has the multi-grafts on it. It now has 12 varieties, so each branch, as I say, apart from the first 4, are a different variety. And as you can see, it's in a garden bed that is growing other things. So one of my catch cries, and I live by it, is what goes well on the plate together goes well in the ground together. So apple and rhubarb, if you've ever had apple and rhubarb pie, you'll know that they certainly go well together. So in the ground together, they go very well. Now, rhubarb being that green, leafy, fleshy, wide leaf plant to the left of this picture is what that is in it. And they have a symbiotic relationship in the soil that actually helps. They help one another. And of course, rhubarb, albeit with wide leaf plants, they generally are forest dwelling plants. So they enjoyed a little bit of shade in the afternoon. So the relationship here sort of works pretty well, apart from in the soil. But in the morning, the rhubarb helps to shade the soil and keep the earth beneath the apple tree a little cooler. And when the sun's overhead in the hotter part of the day, the tree actually provides the shade back for the rhubarb and helps it to keep it cooler. So the other thing I tend to do is companion plant most things. There's always a rhyme and a reason for why I put something together, and in this instance I've got some chives growing underneath the apple, but it could just as easily have been anything from the allium family. So that would be garlic, as I've got chives, garlic chives, onions, spring onions, leek, any of those. They actually help keep the codling moth away. And the codling moth is a pest that gets into apples, and what they do is they lay their eggs into the leaf litter or the mulch below the apple, and as they emerge in the month of October, the little small larvae climb the tree, and by that stage the flowers are finished and the fruit's starting to form, only very small fruit on the tree, and they make their way inside their apple, in your apple, and you don't see how they've gone in, but you certainly see how they come out, because they eat their way out and emerge as a moth. So this companionship actually deters the codling moth from laying its eggs in the first place, and if they happen to lay eggs and the eggs hatch, the larvae move away very quickly because they don't like the sulphur that the allium family exude in the soil. So, and this saves having to use garden sprays, which I urge everyone not to do. I mean, we've got enough trouble with our environment without us making it worse, and the surefire way of adding to that is to be using chemicals. It's vital that we use other methods these days. The bees that we have, and in fact all insect life, is extremely important to preserve if we possibly can. I'll talk about bees a bit later on in this presentation, but it's something that we need to remember. You can see where the grafts have been made. You can see how different the colour of the trunk is, and I'll use a highlighter. So that's a graft there, as you can see. Each of these have been grafted on, so okay. This is an espaliered apricot tree, and as you can see, there's lots of apricots to be had. This is right beside that tree that I've just shown you, and you can see the fence if you look closely just through the tree. So it's a great way of being able to hide the fence. It actually helps give your garden a bit more depth because you can't see beyond them, and utilising that space wisely. I mean, if you had that apricot tree out in the middle of the garden somewhere or in the back lawn, I could guarantee that you would have a tree that would be probably somewhere in the order of maybe 5 or 6 metres wide in diameter, and that's quite a significant amount of space that you lose by planting a tree like that. Whereas here, you barely even know that the tree's there. It's hardly using any space whatsoever, yet it's delivering the same amount of fruit, and you get to utilise the rest of the space left with other things. So I did say that they were productive, and this is an example of quite an old apple tree that is now in the height of production, and as you can see, it's a massive amount of fruit that they produce, and they do it each year. And the beauty of espaliering in the way that we prune these particular trees is that eventually you will wind up not having to worry about pruning the trees at all, because some of the methods that I use, and I'll talk about that again towards the end of this, discourages growth in the winter or in the early spring, and anything that does happen to grow through the spring is discouraged by a particular pruning method in the summer, so that it produces what we call a fruit spur, particularly on apples and pears. And once that happens, that area of the tree will not grow another growth up there, and it will always produce flowers and fruit. And once you learn this method, you'll find that in not so distant future that you'll have trees that just sit there and fruit each year, and you won't have to worry about pruning, which is a wonderful thing. Here's another example. Again, this one's been grown obviously in a cold climate. This area, this is a pear, and you can see how heavily crop the tree is. It's only not a big tree, but certainly full of fruit wherever you look. Absolutely laden. For mine, I think they've probably thinned some of the fruit out, and I'll see if I can't remember to talk about that too when we get to it. But they haven't got a frame as such on this. What they've done is they've used nails, and they've bolted those into the mortar between the bricks, the stones, and they've tied or lashed the tree to those nails. That's an old method they used to use on the Victorian kitchen walled gardens. I've got this here to talk about the beneficial insects that we need to attract in, regardless of whether in your own backyard or over at Polytechnic, and we need to do something about getting some habitat for insects that we are attracting in as predators. I mean, you need quite a few different sorts of insects that visit your garden, and I often say a garden that is buzzing is a garden that's a very, very healthy one. Insects coming and going, doing their thing, means that you've got a wonderful ecosystem alive and well in your garden. So it's one thing to attract the insects in, but if you can provide them a habitat for them to exist as residents in your garden, that's another thing. And this is simply a box that I knocked up, and I've collected some old bamboo stakes from the nurseries as I go and shop there. I ask them if they got any that they're likely to throw out, and if so, I bring them home and cut them up and poke them in this. I've used some old logs, and I've just simply drilled some holes that are about 25 to 30 mil deep, of varying depths, and even a block of timber, as you can see, or a couple of blocks of timber if you look hard. So it doesn't necessarily need to be any particular thing, but what it does is it provides a habitat for things like paper wasps, all sorts of different insects that will become predators for you in your garden. And once you've got these predatory insects in there, when you've got a pest in your garden, they'll come out and deal with it for you. So, and this is just behind one of my apple trees. I have this here to remind me to tell you that when you go and prune anything, which will mean when we come to prune these young trees, it's very, very important to make sure that your equipment is pristine clean. These secateurs are mine, and they're over 30 years old, and yet they look as clean as the day I bought them. What I do is I make sure when I use my secateurs that I take them inside and I use a little bit of detergent, and I get a scourer or even some steel wool, and I scrub all the saps, the tannins and the resins that generally turn those blades black, and get them back to where they should be, and then I spray them with about 80% metho and 20% water. I often say when I'm leading these workshops, you need to become a gunslinger. You need to have your secateurs in one pocket, and in the other side, in the other pocket on the other side, you need to have your metho bottle. And when you draw out your secateurs, you've got to draw out the metho, and before you use them, give one another a squirt. And look, the reason I say that is that if you're not cleaning your equipment when you prune, let's say an apple tree that has mosaic virus, and sometimes you can't tell whether they have or they haven't, and you don't spray and you go to your next apple tree, you've probably just transferred the mosaic virus into the next apple tree you prune. Or it might be, if you're out in your garden deadheading your roses, it's got black spot, and you cut through the sap of the tree, and the sap that has the black spot disease is now on your secateurs. The next rose you go to, you just spread the disease. So it's a really important lesson to remember, and if you can do that, that would be, you'll find that your garden will thank you for it, and you'll get far less trouble in your garden if you practice this. Now, I talked about this method of pruning that I do, and the lateral branch is producing what we call these water shoot growths, which are upright vertical growths. And the framework of the tree is here, and probably just in here somewhere roughly. I can't quite see where that is, but that's the framework of the tree. So all these blue marks are where I would cut these branches, about 4 or 5 buds up from where they've grown off that lateral branch. And what I've done is I actually undercut the bud. So let me show you with the red mark. Now, ordinarily, you wouldn't prune like that. I hope everyone can see where I drew that. This is the one here. I'm going to go over to another spot on the right-hand side of this picture, and I will draw another mark as to how you would normally prune. So that's not quite close enough. That's probably a bit better. Now that's how you would normally prune. And what would happen to that once I pruned it on that angle is that that bud that you can see, that tiny little bud would start and grow. Now what I don't want on, let's go back to the first one that I drew on. The reason I've cut that so far away from this particular bud is I want to cause dieback. And dieback, well, I need to explain better. I've cut this far away from the bud because the bud actually draws the sap. It's the thing that draws sap between the branches. They're the working centres of the tree. The stem between is just basically pipework and structure to deliver to the buds what it needs. And they get obviously water and nutrient, and they respire and breathe. And by cutting it further away, the bud can't draw the sap up to heal that cut, which means that the dieback is caused. And as a result of dieback, what happens normally when you cut close to a bud, it gets an enzyme called the dominant bud enzyme, which causes it to grow, that no other buds get. It's only the bud on the end of a branch that generally gets that. So because I've cut it so far away and the sap has flowed beyond that bud, it doesn't get that dominant bud enzyme. And as I say, it causes dieback. And what happens when dieback occurs on any plant, anything in the plant kingdom that gets threatened with a little bit of death, it starts to flower or tries to flower. So what happens is that instead of getting a dominant bud enzyme, this bud actually gets an enzyme to cause it to become a fruit spur. And fruit spur means that it's going to produce a flower. So, and in the winter, you do this in the summer months, because as you can see, this tree's got leaves on it. Ordinarily, you know, on a young tree, you would prune in winter, but in this instance, you prune in the summer months to try and keep these growth down close towards the branch. So let's move on from here, and I'll show you on the next screen. So these fluffy little wrinkly buds, these are fruit spurs, and these will produce flowers each year. Now, what you've got to do is try and understand what a fruit spur looks like and how that's different to a normal bud. So here is a normal bud on the branch. Very different to these fruit spurs here. And they look a bit like the tail end of a spider, and they don't get much bigger than this. And if you leave these on the tree for the life of the tree, they will always flower in the same spot. So when you're pruning, it's very important that you know the difference between a fruit spur and a normal bud. There's another normal bud. They're very, very different, aren't they? They look completely different. So what we're looking to do is to ensure that, excuse me while I try and, yep. What we're looking to try and do is to turn these sorts of long wispy shoots into fruit spurs, and by undercutting a bud like so, causes a bit of dieback, and then this bud here will turn into a fruit spur. And in the winter months, I generally recommend people do the 3Ds. They take off what is dead, diseased and damaged, and you'll see your handiwork at play, and you'll see that this has got a little bit of dieback, and you just simply prune that off, and you'll notice that where the arrow's pointing to that has started to swell to become a fruit spur. It's a wonderful thing to learn, I can assure you. And if you practice this in time, all of your particularly spur-bearing fruit trees will just have fruit spurs all over them and hardly any growth. Back to that companion planting, there's some chives below that apple tree that we were just talking about. And of course, the chives provide that companionship to keep the codling moth away. Quite pretty, and of course the flowers are edible just as the leaves are. I'm going to get into some floral plants just at the moment, because I think it's important to have some of these things planted in amongst fruit trees, particularly things like this one is echinacea. It attracts in quite a lot of different beneficial insects, not the least of which the European honeybee, which will ultimately help pollinate our trees. And of course, that's the other thing that you need to do. It's all very well to go and plant fruit trees, but if you've got no flowers that are encouraging bees to come in, then you're perhaps not going to get the pollination that you think. So it's really important to make sure that you are planting these sorts of companion plants here and there around the trees or in your garden to entice the pollinating insects. And of course, European honeybees are they're not the only pollinators that we get into our garden. There's plenty of them. This is another great little bee attracting plant, which is borage. The flowers are edible, and so are the fine young leaves. They taste a little bit like cucumber. And once you've got this plant, it tends to seed, and you'll always have it. Dainty little plant. Sometimes I've known people that actually candy these flowers in a sugar syrup, and then they decorate cakes with them. Yeah, they look great. This is another one. This one is feverfew. Another great little plant. Only grows probably about 150 to 200 mil high and around about the same wide. Dotted here and there will attract in all sorts of great little predatory insects, which, as I say, are vital to have within your garden. This guy is a blue-banded bee, and this is one of the native bees that we have that's quite prolific in Victoria. You'll hear these guys before you see them. They're a bit like a bumblebee to some degree. They're quite loud and very quick. The male has 4 bands and the female has 3. They're solitary beasts. They don't make any honey as such, not like the European honeybee. And as I say, I alluded to before, that they're quite loud and in that they buzz and they tend to positively charge themselves through their vibrating. And as a result, when they go near pollen and it's negatively charged, it tends to leap off the flower onto the bee. So they're great pollinators. So you can get these guys in around your flowering fruit trees, or I know we're not talking about vegetables at the moment, but certainly tomatoes. These guys love them, and we're headed into tomato season, so I highly recommend you get some of these sorts of plants. Obviously, this is borage again, as you can see, European honeybee with pollen all over its legs, which is exactly what we're looking to get. And while they're there feeding on your borage or whatever other plant you may have, might be lavender or could be salvia, they'll pay some attention to your fruit trees with any sort of luck. Another great little plant to have in the arsenal of attracting beneficial insects is lobelia. Comes in a variety of different colours, but you'll find for most pollinating insects, mauve and blue flowering plants seem to be the most popular with them. Not sure exactly why. There seems to be some school out on the science behind why I think they seem to recognise these plants easier than they do other colours. So marigolds are another one, whilst these aren't blue or mauve, but this is another great, fantastic plant to have in to assist with keeping a lot of the predatory insect, the pest insects away. Not only do the flowers look attractive, but the foliage are quite aromatic. And some of these plants we call masking plants, which means that when you plant these sorts of plants near something that is attractive to a pest, it deters them because they don't like the scent from the marigold. So you get white fly or thrip or the like. It's not bad to have some of these, and sometimes I'll put these in pots, because you can't always plant everything next to you know, your fruit trees and what have you. So if you put them in pots, you can take the pot to the problem if you happen to get it. You actually make the companion plant mobile. You can take it wherever you need it in the garden to attract the right insect for the right job, whether it be a pollinator or to repel a pest. So that's another thing perhaps worth a note. These are another wonderful little plant called nasturtium. They make fantastic ground covers and terrific underneath fruit trees, particularly apples, because they also help repel codling moth. Not only are they prolific and very attractive, but they are all edible. The flowers, the leaves have a peppery taste, and the seeds that they produce you can actually pickle, and they taste a little bit like capers. They actually nickname them poor man's capers. So when I get an abundance of them, I certainly do that. I love them. They're delicious. And nice to be able to pick a few of the, I mean, you wouldn't sit down and eat a whole bowl full of nasturtium leaves, I can assure you, but a few of them in a salad, particularly with the flowers in amongst them, not only does it look attractive, but it's quite a nice addition to a nice garden salad. Now I have this particular photo here just to remind me to alert everyone that our bees, unfortunately, are in a lot of trouble, and globally that is. And there is a predatory mite called the varroa mite, which fortunately we don't have here in Australia, but we are the only continent left on the globe that doesn't have it. And we did have an incursion last year around about May on a ship from the US with a colony of them heavily infected with varroa mite, but fortunately the colony was near death and it was exterminated. And fortunately for us that we have the CSIRO, who have what they call sentinel hives positioned at strategic distances from each of our ports at 500 metres a kilometre, 1.5 and so on out to 5 kilometres, and they constantly monitor those hives to ensure that we haven't had an incursion at our ports. But unfortunately throughout the rest of the world, and we're actually flying billions of bees to their death out of Australia to help prop up the world's bee population because of the enormous problem that they have, almond fields in the US and the like. And if Einstein's correct, he says that we've only got about 4 years left on the planet if we lose our pollinators. Well, I'm afraid to tell you that already in the highlands of China, which is where these guys are, they're having to get up and pollinate their trees because there are no bees there to help them out. So what can we do about it? Well, we can take heed of what I've been talking about with regard to attracting pollinating insects and providing lots of floral plants that will help them feed and thrive. And we can also perhaps do a bit of an audit and have a look and see what you're using in your garden. That goes at Polytechnic as well as it does in your own backyards. Just check to see what sort of chemicals or fertilisers you might be using, where you could be using something organic or certified organic so that it doesn't have the impact on the bees. You see, it's not just the varroa mite that's causing us a problem. We've got another problem called colony collapse disorder, which is a worldwide phenomenon. And we do have that here, and that's caused by the bees that fly out from between up to 5 kilometres from their hives, collecting nectar and pollen to obviously go back to the hive to either feed with or make honey with. And they store that and they cap it with wax once it's ready. And in the winter months when it's too cold for them to get out and forage or it's wet, they uncap that wax and they feed the hive honey. And unfortunately, it has minute particles of what they call neonicotinoids that are lethal to the bees, and it's in concentrate in the honey, and what's supposed to sustain them actually kills them. I'm a beekeeper. I have 18 hives and I lost 2